In the pale dawn of October 1891, Lancaster County rested beneath a veil of fog so thick it blurred the edges of memory and sound, turning fence posts into silhouettes and distant barns into ghosts. The sky held the weight of an overcast promise, and the land, quiet, humble, watchful, refused to breathe too loudly. The fields of corn, their stalks brittle and yellowed, whispered against one another in a voice too old for English ears, and on the narrow dirt road that split through the valley, not a single wagon wheel stirred. At the end of that road stood the Zook homestead, built from hand-hewn timber and plain stone, its roof sagging in one corner like it had grown tired of holding secrets. Jacob and Ruth Zook lived there alone now, childless, isolated, but never quite forgotten by the community that kept its distance as politely as it prayed. Jacob, once a force of nature behind a plow, had grown thin. Once known for his booming laugh that echoed down rows of beans, he now seldom spoke louder than a whisper. At 47, he should have been in his prime, with strong shoulders and thick hands that still held the memory of labor, but for months he had withered from within. It began subtly. A skipped meal here, a faint complaint of nausea there, until the complaints hardened into ritual, morning sweats, an aching bitterness that curled up in his gut, and a breath that sometimes reeked faintly of metal and spoiled apples. He would clutch his stomach at night, teeth grinding, breath shallow, and Ruth, ever the devoted wife, sat beside him in silence, her hands folded like folded wings, reading scripture in a voice calm as still water. "Let not the Englishers or the bishop find out," Jacob warned her one dusk, his face sunken but his gaze sharp with the last ounce of pride. She nodded, and from that moment onward, she fed him in the quiet, watched over him like a sentry, and prayed over his bones as if she were stitching them one final blanket. Yet every spoonful she offered, every whispered psalm, seemed to hasten the decay. The community assumed it was a wasting sickness, the kind no doctor, Amish or not, could explain. The bishop offered to bring a healer from outside, but Ruth declined politely. "The Lord gives and the Lord takes," she said. No one questioned her. She had always been quiet, modest, a model wife whose baked goods won ribbons at the county fair despite her distaste for compliments. But inside that plain farmhouse, secrets fermented like spoiled milk. Behind the pantry door, locked not with a key but with a wooden wedge Ruth had whittled herself, sat a small, unmarked tin. Beneath a loose floorboard, one Jacob never noticed but Ruth stepped over daily with practiced ease, rested a second tin, its lid scratched once with something sharp. Not enough to mark suspicion, but enough to distinguish. Its contents? Pale powder, fine as sifted flour. Tasteless. Odorless. But when mixed with vinegar and steeped in tea? Deadly. The symptoms matched Jacob's exactly. Not that Ruth would have said such a thing aloud. She simply watched, cared, and continued her routines. She pressed linens with lavender. She hung Jacob's shirts even though he no longer wore them. She polished the stove until it gleamed, and always, she steeped 2 cups of tea. Hers was peppermint. His was darker, more bitter, always poured with a hand too steady for a grieving wife. No one came often, but when they did, they remarked on how clean the house was, how peaceful Ruth seemed even as her husband moaned behind the curtain. And Ruth, always careful, never smiled too much, only enough to show gratitude, never satisfaction. Jacob's final night came without announcement. The sky outside was bruised with storm clouds, and a chill crept into the walls, but Ruth did know. Tea stoked the fire higher. Instead, she tucked her husband into bed and lit a single lantern, its flame casting long, thin shadows across the floorboards. He thrashed once, groaned like an animal stuck in a trap, and then, at last, he stiffened. His mouth foamed white. His limbs twitched, then slowed. His eyes, once brown and fierce, dilated into oblivion. Ruth did not scream. She folded his arms across his chest, kissed his forehead, and sat beside him for 1 full hour before blowing out the lantern and kneeling in prayer. The next morning, she sent word by horse and buggy to the bishop, saying only that her husband had passed into the Lord's hands sometime in the night. The funeral was plain, as Amish funerals are. Jacob was buried in the cemetery beside his father and grandfather, beneath a wooden cross carved with simple scripture. The men of the community dug the hole with care, and the women brought food wrapped in linen, pies, bread, preserved fruit. Ruth wore black. She stood motionless beside the grave and accepted condolences with bowed head. But it was during the meal after the burial, during the soft hymns and muted conversation, that Elder Beeler noticed something he could not ignore. Ruth, always so demure, so passive, was smiling. It was not a grin. It was not joy. It was a tight, private curl of the mouth that looked more like satisfaction than sorrow. He tried to dismiss it. He chalked it up to grief, to shock, to whatever darkness lingered in the heart of a widow who had just watched her world crumble. But the unease sat in his belly like a stone. Later, when the guests had begun to leave and the plates were being cleared, Elder Beeler asked to see the kitchen. Ruth nodded. Of course, she said, her voice soft as bread dough. The kitchen was spotless, cleaner than any he'd seen. Not a crumb, not a smudge, not a single misplaced jar. The pantry shelves had been scrubbed until they gleamed. But one thing stood out. A bottle of vinegar sat uncorked near the stove, and when Elder Beeler leaned toward it, he caught a faint scent, not of pickles or fermentation, but of almonds. Faint. Almost imagined. Almost. He said nothing. He left quietly. But from that day forward, the silence of Lancaster County grew heavy, not peaceful. The crows perched closer to the farmhouse, and the neighbors, though polite, began to whisper after Sunday service. Ruth returned to her routines, alone now, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls of a house that had always seemed to echo too much. She still went to service. She still brought pies. She still prayed. But when she passed, the children turned away, and the men tipped their hats with eyes averted. The bishop met with his elders that week, behind closed barn doors, and spoke of vinegar, of scent, of strange smiles and missing labels. But there was no proof. No English doctor had seen Jacob. No one had tested the tea. No one knew what powder had once sat behind the pantry door. All that remained was Ruth and her silence. Her eerie calm. Her perfect memory of the ordnung. And the strange truth that for all her obedience, she had outlived her husband by design. The weeks that followed Jacob Zook's burial were soaked not in mourning, but in something slower, colder, and far more invasive than grief. It was suspicion, the kind that crept under door frames and slipped into soup bowls, the kind that clung to the hems of women's dresses and stained the edges of hymns, and no matter how often Elder Beeler tried to hold on to silence as tradition demanded, the silence no longer held. Ruth had returned to her routines with an unsettling precision, each movement exact, each word chosen with care, and yet no one could name what exactly felt so wrong. She prayed at service but never lingered after. She brought pies to the next quilting bee but did not sit long enough to stitch. She nodded at passing buggies on the road but never waved. And while these might be the usual grief-etched habits of a widow adjusting to a house suddenly echoing with absence, it was the wrong kind of absence that began to haunt the others, not the hole left by Jacob, but the void in Ruth herself, as though his death had not taken something from her but given her back something she had kept buried. The first to speak the unspeakable was Levi Zook, Jacob's younger brother, whose anger had simmered just beneath the surface even before Jacob had fallen ill. He was the kind of man who plowed deeper rows than necessary, who sang hymns too loudly at services, and who took offense when no offense had been offered. But he was also a man of patterns, and it was the patterns that began to gnaw at him. Jacob had fallen ill too suddenly, too strangely. He hadn't looked like a man dying from within, he had looked like a man being slowly unmade. He died like the chickens we put down after eating the bad seeds, Levi muttered one afternoon while chopping wood with his son, and though he said it low and with a cross of himself immediately after, the words traveled like sparks in dry hay. From there, the stories began to arrive, not all at once, but in slivers. Emma, a woman from the edge of the county who sold herbs and dried flowers at the market, said she had seen Ruth at the English apothecary in bird in hand, buying bitter herbs uncommon in Amish cooking, things like wild laurel and foxglove, things that could heal in one dose and kill in another. Another claimed she'd seen Ruth brewing tea separately from Jacob's, though they always ate supper together. And then came Miriam, Jacob's quiet 12-year-old niece, who had visited the Zook house the week before his death to help Ruth with mending. She said nothing for days after the funeral, only picking at her food and glancing over her shoulder like she'd seen something she didn't understand. It was during evening chores, while brushing the family's old gelding, that she finally whispered to her mother, "Aunt Ruth sprinkled something into Uncle's soup from a small brown pouch, something that didn't look like flour. She told me not to watch." That single confession, spoken with the fragile honesty only a child can carry, was enough to crack the surface of the bishop's resolve. Elder Beeler, whose face had long ago settled into the soft weariness of spiritual burden, convened with Deacon Mast and 2 other elders in the barn behind his house after service one Sunday. The sun had dipped low, the congregation had long returned to their chores and prayers, and inside that creaking barn lit by one rusting lantern, they discussed the matter without accusation, but with grave intention. The Ordnung was not a legal document, it did not have paragraphs or statutes, but it held the strength of centuries, and to violate it was to shake the very bones of their people. But what if it had already been shaken? They could not confront Ruth directly without evidence. They could not call in the English law without tearing their world in two. And yet, they could not ignore what was growing inside the community, a sense that something wicked had passed by, and that it had worn the face of a wife. They decided to send Sister Lydia, the midwife and spiritual mother to many women in the township, under the pretense of support. Lydia had been present at nearly every birth for 3 decades, including Ruth's younger sister before she passed from fever, and it was said Lydia's presence alone could coax the truth out of even the most hardened heart. She arrived with a pie and a woven basket of yarn. Ruth greeted her at the door with a faint smile and invited her in, and the 2 women sat by the window where the light fell across the floor in sharp lines. For over an hour, Lydia asked not. Hing but listened. Ruth spoke in the calm, measured way of someone who had practiced grief until it became a performance. Jacob was sick for a long time, she said, slicing the pie without trembling. He was suffering more than he showed. It was a mercy. Lydia tilted her head. And did he ask for that mercy? Ruth did not flinch. The Lord gives what he gives, and I only did what was asked of me. To watch over him. There was something in her tone, a tightness, a distance, that Lydia could not touch. She asked if Ruth was sleeping, eating, praying. Ruth said yes to each. And then, as the light began to shift toward orange and gold, Lydia asked quietly, "Do you believe the Lord called Jacob home, or do you believe he waited too long?" Ruth folded the linen in her lap with care. Her fingers, once callous from years of milk pails and kneading dough, moved without hesitation. "Some men don't deserve to suffer," she said. "Some debts are paid slowly. Others are accelerated." Lydia leaned forward. "Ruth, what do you mean?" Ruth looked out the window, where the trees stood still in the windless dusk. "The Lord took him when it was time. I merely made the waiting shorter." Lydia said nothing as she stood, placed her hand on Ruth's shoulder, and walked out the door. But inside, her mind reeled. That night, her retelling of the visit lit the match. Word traveled quickly but without names. Amish gossip is never shouted, it is whispered between fence rails, passed in folded notes stuck inside bread baskets, carried by glances over quilts and pauses in prayer. Jacob's grave, still soft in the ground, was no longer visited with reverence but avoided with quiet unease. Some men began to refuse food from Ruth's kitchen. Others told their daughters to avoid her house even during quilting bees. Children stared longer than they should have. And Ruth walked among them as if she were above the weather. She moved like someone not untouched by sin, but liberated by it, freed from something they could end. Name. The bishop knew a reckoning loomed. To do nothing was to erode the ordnung from within. To act too harshly without proof was to risk exile of the innocent. And yet, in every silence Ruth carried, in every word she did not say, there was the echo of something monstrous, something that had once sat at a kitchen table across from Jacob Zook, tea steaming between them, and watched as the poison did what prayers could not. And so the elders gathered again, this time not in secret, but with intention. They would not yet declare Maidong. But they would call Ruth forward. They would ask. They would listen. And if the truth revealed itself, they would do what the ordnung demanded, even if it meant severing one of their own from the body of the church, even if it meant acknowledging that beneath the starched bonnets and silent obedience, there are women who remember every bruise, every silence, every moment they were asked to endure what should not have been endured. And sometimes, those women do not forget. They wait. The wind that swept across Lancaster County in November 1891 was not the kind of wind that passed unnoticed. It moved like a breath held too long, dry and steady, stirring the brittle corn stalks and knocking softly against windows as if to remind the sleeping that something ancient had awakened. The nights had grown longer, the frost sharper, and though the days remained filled with prayer, work, and rhythm, there was an unspoken tremor beneath the ordnung, a recognition that something had ruptured the quiet. It came to a head one evening when the bishop and his elders stood outside Ruth Zook's home, not with torches or papers but with two solemn knocks, the kind of knock passed down for generations and reserved for the gravest summons. Ruth opened the door without surprise. She wore black, her prayer cap tied firm beneath her chin, and her hands, though spo. Ted with age and labor, bore no tremble. She nodded at the men and followed without question, her footsteps silent against the cracked soil as they led her through the shadows to the gathering barn. Inside, 15 men sat in a wide circle formed not by anger but by sorrow, as if the very wood of the beams remembered what had once been sacred and now hung in doubt. A lantern flickered at the center, its flame low, its light pale and flickering over faces hardened not with judgment but weariness. These were not men trained to interrogate, nor to punish, they were shepherds of a quiet people, and now they found themselves facing something the ordnung had no scripture for. Ruth stepped into the circle and did not sit until told. When she did, her posture was straight, and her eyes never dropped. The bishop began with prayer, but the words, though sacred, landed dull in the hay-thick air, each verse a formality rather than a blessing. Finally, he closed his Bible and asked the question that had hovered over the community like a shroud, "Did you poison your husband, Jacob Zook?" The silence that followed was not hesitation, it was a pause shaped like truth, the kind that needs no introduction. Ruth answered, not in whispers, but in the same voice she used to read Psalms aloud. "I did." The room shifted. A soundless gasp moved from face to face. Deacon Mast lowered his eyes. Another elder covered his mouth. But the bishop, trembling, asked again, "Why, Ruth?" Her hands remained folded in her lap. Her jaw tightened only once. "He sinned against God," she said. "And against me." "How?" the bishop whispered, but he already knew. The rumors had been there, half buried, never dared into speech, but now Ruth gave them breath. You thought him kind because he smiled at church and worked hard, she said. But the girls who came to sew with me, those we took into apprentice, they knew the man he truly was. Her voice did not rise. She did not cry. He hurt them. When I wasn't looking. When they were too scared to speak. They left change. Some told me later. Some never did. But I saw it. I saw it in their eyes. I asked him once. He denied it. Then he laughed. The men in the barn sat in stunned stillness. The ordnung had no trial, no cross-examination, no verdicts written in ink. But it had ears, and those ears had heard something that no longer allowed for ignorance. One elder stood as if to leave, then sat again, stricken. Another wept openly. The bishop, his voice hoarse, asked, "Why not come to us?" Ruth's expression broke for the first time, no tears, but the smallest flicker of a bitter smile. "Because no one listens when the man wears the beard," she said. "You would have asked him. He would have denied it. The girls would have been shamed. Their fathers would have called them liars. And I would have been told to pray harder." A hush fell like snowfall, thick, muffling, final. "So I listened to God instead," Ruth said. "And to the silence inside me that would not go away." She told them, plainly, how it had unfolded. How she had learned of bitter almonds and the oils they released. How she had read of powders that left no trace, only symptoms that mimic natural sickness. She had tested it first on rodents near the barn. Then small doses in Jacob's tea. He weakened gradually, never suspecting. She wept over him as he declined. Fed him. Prayed for him. And when the time came, she watched the final seizure not with cruelty, but with resolution. "He died believing I loved him," she said. "And in some strange way, I did. But not enough to let him keep breathing." The bishop stood slowly, his legs shaking. "You confess this freely?" "I do," Ruth said. "I came ready." "You understand what must follow?" "Yes." And so it was declared. Ruth Zook, for the crime of murder, and for stepping beyond the bounds of the ordnung, would be placed under Maidong shunning. She would not be imprisoned, nor turned over to the English authorities, for to do so would be to invite a system that had no understanding of their world. But she would be dead to them. No one would speak to her. No one would eat with her. She would live at the edge of the county, her name spoken only in warning or prayer. She accepted this fate with a nod. When she stood to leave, not one man dared meet her eyes, but every man would remember them, white, dark, and unrepentant. She returned to her house that night alone. By dawn, she was gone. She did not pack loudly. She left no note. Only the faint smell of vinegar and lavender remained. Months passed. The seasons turned. Her house stood empty, eventually sold to a distant cousin, and life in Lancaster resumed its rhythm, though never quite as it had before. But Ruth did not vanish completely. 1 year later, a letter arrived at the Bird-in-Hand post office, addressed not by name but by designation, to the elders of the church. It came from a detective in Philadelphia. He had been investigating the death of a woman who had died after taking herbal tonics sold by a mysterious healer, an older Amish woman who never gave her full name, only said she knew how to take away suffering. The tonic had smelled faintly of almonds. When the authorities arrived at her cottage, it was empty. The fire was still warm. A teacup sat on the table, half drunk. In the pantry, the shelves were clean, but the air held a sweetness no one could name. They never found her. Not in the city, nor in the townships beyond. Some say she boarded a train headed west, wearing a plain gray shawl and a look no one dared question. Others claimed she had been taken in by another separatist sect who never asked what she'd done, only what she knew. And some whispered still darker tales, that she walked among the dead, that she had crossed the veil, that she now wandered the night carrying justice for those never believe. Back in Lancaster, her name was no longer spoken in service, but the widows remembered. They whispered her name when vinegar smelled strange. They clutched their aprons tighter when men raised voices in barns. And though the ordnung remained unchanged, a quiet shift took place among the women, more meetings in kitchens, more stories shared in code, more understanding passed between silent glances. Ruth Zook, the widow who had poisoned her husband, had become not only a warning but a question. A challenge. A reckoning. And in the quiet corners of Lancaster County, where quilts hung heavy with memory and the prayers came too easily, her name echoed softly, like the whisper of poison in tea.